Serious, people who accidentally killed someone. How are you? I don't know if you're going to find many people who actually killed someone, so I'll give my story. I did not kill her, but I partially paralyzed her for life. I was 16, just started driving, and had no idea I had a seizure disorder. I had my first seizure behind the wheel, ran through an intersection, and T-boned a van with a nanny and 4 small children. Thankfully, all the kids ended up fine and were actually running around after the accident saying that was fun. Let's do it again, but the nanny did not end up okay. I talked to her only once after and she said she wasn't angry at all. It made me feel like crap though, and I think about it a lot. My brother-in-law died a few years ago. He was a young adult, crossing the street on his skateboard against the light, and was hit by a driver who was already in the motion and had the right of way. From the driver's perspective, he just popped out from behind an immobile truck in the left lane, directly into his path. In the months after the funeral, my wife found the driver's contact info from the police report and wrote him a letter telling him about her brother's life and letting him know that they don't blame him and that he shouldn't blame himself. She got a letter back a few weeks later from this young man who had obviously been really struggling with it, and he was extremely grateful for my wife's letter, that it helped lift some of the guilt he'd been feeling. He said the accident had made him really rethink his life, how fragile it is, and he was changing careers into something he could use to make a difference for people. I think my brother-in-law, who was simultaneously the biggest hearted and most cynical person I've ever known, would have scoffed at that, but eventually respected it. I love your description of him as simultaneously the biggest hearted and most cynical person I've ever known. It's wonderful that your wife was able and willing to reach out like that, and I'm sure it was healing for both her and the driver. My 16-year-old brother and 3 of his friends went out drinking one night. On their way back home, my brother swerved to miss a Volkswagen and hit a utility pole. The pole fell, crushing his 2 friends and the back of the truck to death. The third boy was sitting shotgun in the cab, and it damaged his right arm, which had to be amputated. My brother had grown up with these boys, and he felt awful about what happened. The parents of the dead boys told my brother they didn't blame him, but he blamed himself and started drinking heavily. He died of liver disease when he was 31. This story is heartbreaking and I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sure your family has suffered greatly and I hope that you all have found peace somehow. I was 10 years old and I was playing in the woods by a lake with my best friend. We were playing with BB guns and were throwing lawn darts around like idiots. I was shooting my BB gun when he was crouching to pick one of the darts up. I was shooting above him and right at that moment he got up and the 1 in a million chance occurred that I hit him right in the eye. He stumbled back and plummeted right into the lake. I didn't notice I shot him in the eye and called out for him. Then I noticed blood in the water. He hit his head on the stone ground. I ran towards him as fast as I could. I dragged him out of there. Now, this was in 1984, so we didn't have any cell phones. Thus I strapped my shirt around his entire head and carried him back to my house, which luckily wasn't too far away. He now has a glass eye and suffers from serious memory loss, long term. 30 years later and I'm still friends with him. He doesn't remember what happened that day, but I feel so much guilt for it. I can never forgive myself. I used to work at a very large hospital in Utah on a floor where the docs like to send patients that were near death. One of the patients I was taking care of that day was a middle-aged lady who was going home that day on hospice, end-of-life care. She was unconscious for a few days and had just recently woken up. Since she was unable to eat or drink anything while unconscious, she almost immediately asked for some water. We were reluctant but gave in, eventually figuring she's going to go home soon and drink there anyway. I did my best to reduce the risk of aspiration, but due to severe pain I couldn't sit her up as far as I would like. She took a drink and aspirated on it, basically drowned in front of her daughter. I'll never forget the sheer panic on those faces. I came close once, and it troubled me for a long time. My grandfather, who I was adopted by, suffers from PTSD. While he's had faults as a parent, he is one of the people I respect the most. I don't know how familiar you are with PTSD flashbacks, but they can be pretty frightening, and they're hard to predict. One day I came home from school and he was yelling at my sister, who's 2 years my senior. A 30-year Vietnam veteran yelling is a very, very scary experience, especially because he does not yell normally, no matter how upset he gets. He began to threaten her, and things got physical. I felt as if I had to step in, and so I did. It was very difficult to remain calm because things were getting violent and everybody was yelling. My sister was yelling at him for being mad. He was practically growling, and my grandmother and myself were trying to verbally calm him down. Eventually he grabbed my sister by the neck, and I had to step in. I fought him, and it ended with me kicking him just below the sternum and staggering him. He calmed down, but didn't remember anything. For him, it's like it never happened. The next week he had internal bleeding. I had managed to severely damage the surgical apparatus that had been placed in his stomach after a recent bowel bypass surgery. He ended up going to the hospital and came close to dying a few times. It was very frightening for me. I've regretted not being able to stop him without hurting him, and regretting how close he came to death. I don't know what I'd do if he had died. He still doesn't remember. As far as I know, he thinks it was a complication with the original surgery. That's intense. PTSD is a B. So I decided to create an account to tell my story. To start off, many of you may read my story and say it was an accident and I was really young and I didn't really know any better, and that I shouldn't hold myself accountable for it. When I was 5 years old I was being babysat by a preschool teacher with my younger brother, just under 2 years old. It was just another morning and my brother really loved grapes. I remember grabbing them out of the fridge and sitting down on the couch. I fed him one, and within seconds he began to choke. Being that young I had no idea what was going on. The babysitter went in shock and immediately called 911. I really had no idea what was going on. Looking back on it, it kills me that the first thing that I did was get my police car, fire truck and display them on the couch. I remember them taking him out of the house on the gurney. I remember them taking off. I remember the people around the neighborhood coming and knocking on the door and the babysitter telling me to stay away from the door. I remember going to her mother's house as she bawled her eyes out and still I thought it was all a game and I was playing with toys. I remember finally going to the hospital and seeing my other crying like I've never seen her cry before with my father. My father picked me up and asked her how I felt losing my brother. I replied I feel like having an ice cream. I really can't believe, looking back on it now, that I thought that way, but yeah I was 5. I'm 23 now, almost 24. Around 18-19 years old it really began to affect me. My friends are always talking about their brother and sister's graduations, and I can't help but wonder what it would have been like to attend my brother's graduation. What it would have been like to fight with him, give him girlfriend advice and take him to school. My mother suffers from complete depression and their marriage has been pretty crappy since. My mother went to alcohol and fortunately it has gotten better, only recently. I know I was young, but I can't help but hold myself accountable for how everything turned out. So to answer the questions, how am I? I live my life the best I can knowing I played a role in my brother's death. I never really speak of it, only to my GF or to only one of my closest friend. I never mention this to my parents. It already kills them to know they lost a child as it is. It hurts to think about it, and often those memories play in my head. I've decided to live my life to protect the lives of others, and sometimes, I think it's because of my own guilt. I hope this answers your question, OP. Back in the 80s, my brother killed his best friend when a gun they were playing with accidentally went off. Yes, very stupid. Guns are not toys, always loaded, etc etc. My mom had to clean the blood off the kitchen floor and never allowed guns in the house again. I couldn't even have water guns when I was little and she was visibly freaked out by the prop gun I had to use for a school play once. This all happened before I was born, so I only understood weird unspoken tension around guns in our house when I was older and it was explained to me. Edit. Actually it was after The Sixth Sense came out. Remember that scene with the teenage boy saying he wanted to show you his dad's gun, and then he turns around and the back of his head's blown off? He was the right age. in the right clothes, and my mom went ghost white when she saw that scene. I think she called my brother and warned him not to go see it. As for my brother, he spent I think 2 years of his high school career at the boys ranch instead of in school. That simultaneously helped him and gave him a bunch of not so awesome friends. He spent about a decade on drugs, being kicked out of university for drugs, making highly questionable life decisions, working as a short order cook at a tiny slimy restaurant, overall not liking himself very much. Then back in the 90s he had a baby with his girlfriend at the time. Caring for his daughter gave him the impetus to clean up and start living with himself instead of zoning out through chemical means. Although it took almost another decade to really get better, including a few years where he somehow managed to substitute zoning out with video games for drugs and lost a couple jobs and relationships that way. And during that time he is doing wonderfully today, in his late 40s. He has a fulfilling career, a house, a wife, 3 kids, and most of the time just talks about how lucky he is. I think he feels like he got a second chance at life. His oldest daughter spends summers with them and is starting college next year. His family is fantastic. He is fantastic. I think he still thinks about his friend from time to time, but he has lived with it for decades and it is now part of his life story instead of the entirety of his life story. Guilt isn't his primary emotion in life anymore. He's got a lot of love around him. One of my half-brothers was driving during a blizzard. Long story short, a younger woman was walking in the street during a whiteout, and he hit her head with his side mirror. She didn't make it. He got out of the car to help, and 2 of her guy friends who were walking with her beat the crap out of him. That was like 15 years ago. I was very young, and only learned about this recently. I don't know if you can blame the accident, but he now suffers from depression and is in rehab for various drugs. He's sort of a loser now, but I've been told he used to have his crap together before the accident. That has got to be the most retarded reaction to a car accident I've ever heard. My friend has been hit by a car and needs an ambulance. Let's freak up the driver who was coming to help. I have killed someone. It wasn't accidental, but it wasn't intentional either. I was in the Navy and was involved with border patrols for illegal fishermen, boat people, smugglers, etc. Off the north of Australia. We are to board a boat of illegal fishermen who had been dynamite netting and they made a dash for international waters. I was part of the boarding party and we all jumped into the rib and intercepted the fishing crew. To stop us from boarding had sharpened bamboo poles they had dipped into the bilge to jab at us to stop us from boarding before they got to international. We had orders not to shoot but to defend ourselves if attacked. We got in close and one of the fishermen went to jab the guy next to me and I swung and hit him with the butt of my shotgun. I intended to knock him down or out but not to kill him, but due to adrenaline put a lot more force into it than I intended, crushing his skull. We were able to board and the guy was medevaced but he died on the flight to Darwin. Emotionally I was fricked up for a long time. They don't tell you this but killing is so easy that it's scary, and it was the ease of which I did it that bothered me, more than any guilt I had for taking a life. At the time I didn't feel anything like guilt or pleasure, just shock at how easy it was. Then I felt guilty for not feeling anything. For a long time I thought I was a monster and stayed away. I eventually got help and was diagnosed with PTSD, but even so I don't feel the same and don't like to get too close to people. It definitely had a very negative effect on my life. That is really scary and a totally understandable string of emotions you went through. I'm sorry that you haven't fully healed from the experience. I truly wish you well and hope you can find peace. This is one of the very few times that I have discussed this with anyone. I was in an accident when I was 16. I was waiting to turn left on a busy highway, and I pulled out in front of a motorcycle. I came up with a million reasons in my head why I didn't see him, but it came down to the fact that I didn't look that last time after the last car came by. I killed him and seriously hurt his wife. Most of that night was a blur. I remember very little until I went home. That is when I found out that it was the father of one of my classmates, someone I knew very well from kindergarten on, in a class of less than 50 in elementary school. I killed my friend's dad. They took me to the hospital to get a blood test to make sure I wasn't drinking or on drugs. They took me to the same hospital he was taken to. They walked me right past his family in the lobby. I was so overwhelmed that I passed out in front of them. I saw his empty chair at school for days. Then every day I had to go to class with him in the chair. I saw him every day. For years. He hated me, and rightfully so. His friends hated me, and confronted me about it. Rumors swirled that I tried to beat the motorcycle, pull out faster than him getting to me, or that I said watch this first. People hated me in school for a while. I didn't know how to act. I was normally a very happy person. I was a mess inside but didn't show it. People asked me how I could smile for weeks after it happened. I cried a lot when no one was around. My mother was a mess. She cried a lot. The accident happened at the only entrance to my neighborhood. I drove by the spot every day. It made me hate myself more every time I saw it. I had nightmares. But more than the nightmares, I had these amazing dreams. Dreams where he told me that he forgave me. I woke up crying from happiness. All I wanted in life was for him to forgive me. For years I didn't go a day without thinking about it. It has been over 15 years and I still dream about him forgiving me. It eats me alive to know that I destroyed a family. He never got to see his son and daughter grow up. They didn't get to have their dad at Christmas, graduation, or their weddings. He was a nice guy and didn't deserve it. Up until I had a child, I would have given my own life to bring his back. To his family, I say I'm sorry. I truly am. I wish I could change it. I wished I had looked left one more time. I have a son now and I can't imagine being robbed of those moments. I'm so sorry. I don't want to give too much away. I was on a jury some years ago. Coincides with your time frame. For this exact same scenario, if you recognize the following, you should contact me. The Big Dip by Lone Butte store. If you don't, please disregard this and accept my condolences and I apologize for bothering you. My babysitter, around 16, was at his house with his sister and a mutual friend. They got drunk and were playing with a shotgun. My babysitter told his sister to shoot him in the face, but don't worry because it wasn't loaded and the safety was on. Neither of those facts were true. His sister shot him in the face and instantly killed him. After that, his sister went hard drug addict, kicked out of school, homeless for a while, major problems. The family, unwarranted, was shunned by a lot of people for having a gun laying around like that. The family was and still is a complete mess, roughly 20 years later. Almost sort of. When I was younger my best friend had been struggling with depression for a few years. She called me late one night as I was getting ready for bed and said she needed to talk. I was just getting into the shower and promised to call her back when I was clean. I got into that warm fuzzy post shower. Oh my god, my bed is so comfortable bedtime state and neglected to call. The next day I couldn't get a hold of her and figured she was angry. The day after that I found out she had taken a few bottles of pills that night and they weren't sure if she was going to wake up. I spent the next 2 days in heck. I was in class when I got the call that she woke up and the first thing she asked for was Emmy. Only time I have ever sobbed out of happiness. I have made a point to make my shoulders as available as possible ever since. She passed away 2 years later. I miss her terribly. Same thing happened to me except we're male. He gave plenty of warning and called me the night before and I didn't answer. Next day he stepped in front of a train. I wish that was something he could wake up from. I'd like to add though, it's nice to hear that you've made yourself more available because of what you two went through. You're a good person. I don't know if it counts as an accident but someone mugged me, gave him everything and he still tried to stab me, just by default. After a decade of martial arts training, I redirected the knife into his chest. It messed me up for a while but it was him or me I guess. I've always had a pretty low empathy quotient so it's probably easier for me than most people but I just try not to think about it. I was working in a bar a few summers ago. It was coming close to closing time and everyone was drunk but no one was belligerent or in need of being cut off. A man came to the bar. I served him his last drink. He left the bar and called his girlfriend. She heard him being hit by the taxi over the phone. He died instantly. I didn't kill him. Neither did the taxi driver, but it's hard not to think about things like would I think about this less if I hadn't been the last one to serve him. Death is strange. My story is similar. kid's idiot sense of being indestructible and not knowing how to swim is what killed him. Everyone said I followed the correct procedures, but it took a while to come to terms with that. In 2010, a young man on a motorcycle crossed the center line and hit me head on. He was killed instantly. I was completely in shock. I stopped the car and checked on him, my passengers, and finally myself. Other than him, we were injury free for the most part. I had nightmares about it for weeks, and to this day I have trouble driving around curves or around motorcycles. I hate motorcycles with a passion. Definitely an experience you don't get over. I was with my parents when we accidentally killed a woman who walked across a highway. They found she had drugs in her system from the autopsy, but not necessarily from that day. But she was on a downward spiral and her mother knew it too. She was in her 20s. Overall, it just seemed we were the ones she chose to walk in front of to end her life. It was quite a sad story for her and we were sad for her and tried to talk to her mother. It's been a year now, but we are fine. I mean, we never knew her after all. Before someone asks, yes, our van was totaled. RIP. This isn't my story, but my teacher, who was a former lawyer, shared this story with us. One of her clients was a guy who went out one night and had a few beer too much but decided to take the car anyway. He did not know that there was a guy under his car trying to cut some cables in order to steal the car or whatever, so he started the engine and the guy's belt got stuck under the car. He was down there for about 15 minutes and the car was leaving a trail of blood behind. The driver noticed after some time and was afraid of getting into prison for killing the guy and just put him somewhere beside the street. A passenger found him some minutes later still alive. He can't move his legs now and his whole backside looks awful, but sued that guy who drove it over with my teacher as the lawyer. She said the other guy was really sorry and it was awful to watch this young 18-year-old's life getting destroyed by an accident that wasn't all his fault. The guy shouldn't have been under the car. I got into a head-on collision in the early 2000s on a tiny 2-lane road in the middle of nowhere country. I pulled out to pass a car on a legal passing road that was going 25 miles per hour under the speed limit. After checking to make sure no one was coming. When I pulled out to pass the car though, they sped up so I could not get back over. What I didn't realize was up ahead there was a cornfield that blocked a blind turn in the road. I realized too late that a sedan was headed my direction and I couldn't merge back to my lane as the car I tried to pass was equal with me. So, I did the next logical thing. I swerved to the side of the road. Unfortunately, so did the car headed towards me. Both of us hit dead on going 55 miles per hour and no, the other car did not stop, as it was a country road and not much traffic. I think it was a few minutes before someone stopped, but I'm not entirely sure. The adrenaline had taken full effect at that point. The person who finally stopped pulled me out of the car and I knew as soon as the paramedic arrived and said we have 1F that I had killed someone. I completely lost my mind on the side of the road and had to have 3 people hold me down. I'm a 5 feet 1 inches female for reference. I found out later that the driver of the other car was killed and his father in the passenger seat was in critical condition. The driver was the only son and he died on his mom's birthday and was buried on his 18th birthday. I compartmentalized the pain for a year until the following year I got a newspaper clipping in the mail that the father had wrote about me. I know it was his grief speaking, but he essentially called me a murderer. It was at that moment that every ounce of pain, guilt and shame hit me. I killed a man who was only a year younger than me. What does this mean for me? Is karma so harsh that I will prematurely lose my child because of what I did? Accident or not, it took a year for me to face the pain, and every year on that date, it all comes back to me. I know the accident wasn't my fault. It was officially deemed the state's fault as the road shouldn't have been a passing road. But I also know it could have been prevented, and that's what hurts the most. I made a throwaway for this. I am responsible for the death of my girlfriend, Paige. 3 years ago, we were out camping with another couple we were close with. During our trip, I took Paige farther up the river. I ran over something sharp on the way up that popped a tire and I lost control of the car. I was not able to react fast enough to prevent the car from going over the hill. There was a lot of trees and rocks between us and the river. It felt like we went into slow motion as I reached to try and protect her from as much impact as I could. After the drop, I held her lifeless body in my arms for hours before a rescue team showed up. I was crying the entire time. I got out with a broken leg and 3 broken ribs, but one simple impact to her head was enough to rob me of the love of my life. I wake up in the middle of the night in a bead of sweat a couple times a month from nightmares of the accident. It has not been easy for me, but I still work and try to get out as much as I can. Just because I have a hole in my heart doesn't mean it stopped beating. I owe it to Paige to try and live a happy life. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.